Guys, forget about WoW. Forget about BDO's new update. Forget about New World Seasons. This is the only MMO you need to be playing right now. And that game is Raid Shadow Legends. Just kidding. It's Lord of the Rings Online. So I'll start by saying that this game's not for everybody. It is 16 years old and it's pretty rough around the edges, but it holds on to that old school MMO vibe, and it reminded me a lot of playing Everquest. This could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your preference. If you need a really clean game that's polished and has all sorts of quality of life features, then it might not be for you. But if you value MMOs that are immersive, focus more on story and progression, and are just a little bit more low-key, then I think you'll be in for a good time. So let's get into it. This is why Lord of the Rings Online is the very best MMO to start playing in 2023. There's no denying that the graphics are a bit dated to say the least, but there's something about this game that makes you forget how, to put it frankly, bad it looks. And that's having just a ridiculous amount of immersion. So many different elements of this game pull you into the world that honestly at this point I like how it looks. Let's start with the sound design because it might be one of the game's best qualities. I've never really been one to care too much about sound in an MMO, but after playing this, I'm starting to think it's something developers should spend more time on. The music in this game is so incredibly good. There is a ton of variety and it perfectly sets the mood depending on where you're at. I could seriously probably make a video just talking about my 10 favorite songs from this game. There are that many good ones. The impressive sound design goes beyond just the music, however, because the sounds of combat are really good as well, and do a lot to make it more enjoyable. You don't just hear a generic sound whenever you hit your enemy. Your character is shouting and making noises which reflect the battle that you're in. Just listen to this for example. 4. This generic enemy has 4 different sounds for each of his attacks. This does so much to make combat more engaging. And even out of combat, the ambient sound is incredibly immersive. You can hear birds and the wind in the background, and when you get close to the fire, you hear it crackle. And when you click on the NPC, he talks to you. The sound in this game does such a good job pulling you into the world, and I really hope future MMOs like Ashes of Creation give this the focus it deserves. Another thing this game does to build immersion is world design. It's created in a way that makes the world feel massive. Each zone isn't cluttered with enemies or NPCs. There's space in this game that has no other purpose than to exist and be a part of the environment, something that you don't see much anymore in MMOs. When exploring the world, you run into a ton of vistas that let you look off into the distance, and call me crazy, but when you're playing it really looks beautiful. You see this and you want to explore the new areas. And even within the different zones, there's a tremendous amount of variety. You'll experience different weather, lighting, and environmental factors depending on where you're at. The best example of this is when I walked into the old forest for the first time. Watch as the color slightly change and everything gets a slight haze over it. This is incredible and truly gave me the feeling that I was walking into a dark, deep forest. And the design of the forest just added to this as well. The path disappeared and I actually had to explore a bit to find my way. A few times I met a dead end and had to backtrack to find my way forward. I actually kind of got lost in the forest, but I loved it because an old forest should be difficult to navigate. So many MMOs are scared to do something like this for the risk of turning a player away, but if it's actually done in a way that makes sense in the context of the world, like it's done in Lord of the Rings Online, it's incredibly immersive and makes for a great moment in the game. Lord of the Rings Online immerses you into the world better than many other MMOs, and it goes such a long way in making it an enjoyable experience. I'm not an RPer at all, but I completely understand why people just like hanging out in this game. It just feels good. I'm by no means a Lord of the Rings enthusiast. I've watched the movies and the shows, and I do really like the franchise, but I know very little outside of what a general fan might know. But luckily, the game does a pretty good job introducing you to the story to understand what's going on.
The Nazgul have crossed the Eisen and are heading for the Shire. The hobbits must be quick-footed enough to escape the wrath of the Nine.
You always have part of a questline that progresses you through the main story and keeps you on track. And this main story is supported by side quests, which are typically around the area that the main story is bringing you. There were a few times where the level suggestion for the main story quest was a bit high, so I was able to complete a few side quests in the area to get me to the level suggested. This is a really nice touch, as I never really felt lost on what to do next. I had a clear path to follow, and I could stray from it if I wanted or if necessary, but I always knew how to get back. As you get further into the story, you start running into some well-known characters, which adds some familiarity to the game, even for a casual fan. Frankly, it's just really cool to get a quest from Gandalf. Knowing a little bit about who he is adds to the weight of the quest. Lord of the Rings Online has 11 classes, each of which mostly have 3 different talent trees to select from: a support, a damage, and a heal or a tank. Now, starting just generally with the classes, there is such a good variety to choose from, and I'm so happy to see support-focused classes. This is a little bit of an aside, but for some reason, MMOs seem to have phased out support classes outside of healing, and it's so sad to see. I'm a huge fan of classes that focus on debuffing an enemy or buffing a friend, and Lord of the Rings offers that. So far, I've tried a traps-focused ranger, which I've learned is essentially useless in group content, a healing-focused guardian, which I've since learned are the worst healers in the game, and a healing-focused minstrel, which is the only spec I've selected that works thus far. But even with selecting bad class and spec combinations, none of it has hindered my time. I've been able to play however I want, and with the variety of combinations available, I'm excited to try the others out. One negative to call out here, at least with the free-to-play version, you can only have 2 characters on a server at a time. One of the strengths of this game is the variety of playstyles with its classes, and I think limiting free players to just 2 is not a good decision. For a game that lacks a lot of quality of life features, one feature it does have that is done really well is the loot system. Essentially, when you kill an enemy, a loot option pops up on the right side of your screen. If you click it, you can see your available loot. But what this game does a little differently is that all of your loot just keeps getting added to this bag as you move around. So if you have a quest to kill 10 wolves, you don't need to stop between each one and loot. All of it just automatically gets added to this bag. Now, you do need to loot it into your inventory within an hour, but that's almost always enough time to find a shop, loot everything, and sell it. I will say that at first I didn't like this system. I missed the idea of clicking on the enemy and seeing my loot, but after a little while, the convenience of this system really overcame that. Now to move on to some of the bad things, and honestly it all comes down to 2 things. 1, the game is 16 years old, and 2, it's pay to win. Let's start with the store. You can spend money on this game for just about anything. You can buy buffs, mounts, boosts for experience, boost for levels, boost for professions, items, so it is pay to win in some ways. But for whatever it's worth, none of it is forced onto you. I've progressed just fine in this game without purchasing anything. The game also has a good amount of lag, and it did recently receive an update that supposedly fixed it, but I still experienced it quite a few times. Often I would try to harvest something and it wouldn't work, or my character would just freeze for a few seconds and I wouldn't be able to move, or I would try to attack an enemy and there'd be a slight delay in my actions. It isn't anything game breaking, I've been able to play through it, but I could definitely see players being turned away from this game because of it. The game's also quite old, and over time it's had a number of different developers behind it, and that bloat kind of shows. There are a lot of different elements to this game, and at least so far, not a lot of it has been introduced or explained to me. The UI also feels really cluttered. You're throwing a lot of stuff. You get a hang of it all eventually, but it does feel pretty messy. Overall, I would describe Lord of the Rings Online as a really good game in a really ugly wrapper. I can understand why it never really took off as the premier MMO, but I can also understand why people are still playing it today, 16 years later, especially if you like old school MMOs. Lord of the Rings Online provides a very immersive and enjoyable experience that, for me, is still one of the best around even today. They're still making updates to the game, including an expansion that's supposed to come out later this year that introduces a new race, a new class, a new zone, and potentially a level squish, which makes right now a really good time to jump on board. So that's all I got. Honestly, I've just really been enjoying my time playing Lord of the Rings Online, and I'll probably continue for quite some time. If you'd like to join me, come say hi on Gladden. Until the next one.